We are delighted to have amongst us an expert speaker on this issue today, Mr. Sadanand Dhume. He writes about South Asian political economy, foreign policy, business and society, with a focus on India and Pakistan. He is also a South Asian columnist for Wall Street Journal. He has worked as a foreign correspondent for Far East Economic Review in India and Indonesia, and was a Bernard Schwartz Fellow at the Asia Society in Washington, D.C. His political travelogue about the rise of radical Islam in Indonesia, named My Friend the Fanatic, Travels with Radical Islam, has been published in 4 countries. Today the title for this talk is The Evolution of Radical Islam in Pakistan and What It Means for Southeast Asia. It is, I just want to bring to your notice a couple of things. This event is funded and supported by graduate government, and this talk will be followed by a small question-answer forum. So please welcome Mr. Dhume today.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for that kind introduction, Sharmishta. Thank you, Umar, for inviting me. I'm Sadanand Dhume. I work at AEI, as she just said, and I write very broadly about India and Pakistan, about the politics, about the economics, about what's happening in society, and so on. Before coming to AEI, a few years ago, I used to work and live in Indonesia, and I really got sort of interested in this subject, in the idea of radical Islam and terrorism, which I believe is its most dramatic manifestation, while I was living in Indonesia as a foreign correspondent. And what happened there was that I was there when the Bali bombings occurred in 2002, and I remember very clearly boarding a plane in Jakarta and heading to Bali where I was the only person on the aircraft, because everybody else was leaving Bali just after the bombing, and the only people going in were the reporters and the forensics teams and the police to investigate it. And that kind of got me interested in the subject. It ended up in a book, and I've continued to write about it, though I have to say that it's certainly not the only thing I write about. It's a small subsection of my work. Now today I'm going to keep my comments fairly informal. It's a sort of young group. I don't have a very elaborate or extremely well-structured presentation, but what I'm going to do is try and give you a broad historical overview of where I think Pakistan has come to and where it's come from. And after that, I'd just sort of like to have a conversation with you, have a discussion, get your sense of how you view these things, and I'd be very happy to delve into these issues deeper and give you my sense of how to think about them, or at least how I think about them, and how this all sort of fits into a larger puzzle, both in South Asia and beyond. Now to begin with, I'm going to start with 2 very dramatic, vivid scenes that I think really define the problem in Pakistan, and both of these scenes come from this year. The first one was in early January, when Salman Taseer, who was the governor of Punjab, which is the largest province in Pakistan and holds about 60% of Pakistan's population. Salman Taseer, the governor, had just emerged after lunch at a very upscale market in Islamabad, which was frequented by diplomats and the wealthiest Pakistanis, when he was gunned down by his own bodyguard. His bodyguard shot him more than 20 times and immediately then surrendered to his fellow bodyguards and declared that he had killed this person, Salman Taseer, the governor, because the governor, he felt, had attacked Islam. What had happened, the backstory, as many of you must be aware, is that Governor Taseer had opposed the implementation of Pakistan's blasphemy law. And under the blasphemy law, if you are accused of saying something against the Prophet Muhammad, you can be sentenced to death. And Governor Taseer was effectively standing up for their rights of a Christian peasant woman named Asia Bibi, who had been sentenced to death, is on death row right now. He felt a terrible injustice had been done to this lady, and he wasn't saying that he wanted to scrap the law. All he said was that it was being implemented in a way that tended to victimize minorities, and he wanted that to change. This was deemed as a provocation by his murderer, and he was killed. But what's more interesting about this scene, the first of the two scenes, what's more interesting about it is not just what happened, but how the country responded. Because what you saw for the first time, I think, was a sense that this kind of act was not something that was entirely on the margins. So for Governor Taseer's own funeral, only about 500 people showed up. About 35,000 people showed up on the streets of Lahore, cheering Qadri, who was the person who killed him. So you kind of saw this big imbalance play out right there, where the people who were behind the assassin really had street power, whereas the people who were behind the man who was murdered felt cowed and intimidated. And in fact, the president himself did not show up for Salman Taseer's funeral, even though the President Zardari, was a very old political associate and close friend of the governor. So that's the first scene, which sort of leads to a kind of troubling set of questions about the direction in which society is headed. I don't say that most people are fundamentalist, let alone violent, but I think that there is an uptick in the amount of fundamentalism if you compare it to the past. So that's the first. And the second scene, of course, all of you would be much more familiar with, even those of you who don't follow South Asia, which is the Abbottabad raid in May. And that really kind of, if the Salman Taseer assassination brought the problem of fundamentalism onto the front pages of the Pakistani press, and in front and center for Pakistani consciousness, particularly Pakistani liberal educated consciousness, then the Bin Laden affair really kind of raised the question about the US alliance with Pakistan and how much Pakistan could really be trusted in prosecuting its side of what we used to call the war on terror. And that, of course, happened in May, where a team of Navy SEALs went in. They found Osama bin Laden, killed him, dumped his body in the Indian Ocean. But again, what's interesting, more interesting than the events themselves, is the events are very dramatic. In this case, is the setting. And the setting is Abbottabad, which is give or take 40 miles from Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. But it's also the site of the single most important military training academy in Pakistan. So it's really the equivalent, if you were to draw an equivalent with the US, it would sort of be like he was found hiding in, West Point or Annapolis. It's a place that is sort of synonymous with the military, and here you have the world's most wanted man found over there. And again, it raised a question which has come up over and over and continues to sort of haunt our front pages and haunt all our discussions about Pakistan, which is, what exactly is the Pakistani state's role in sheltering these kinds of elements? So those are that sets the broad scene of Pakistan. And now I'm going to move on to my little historical sort of overview of where Pakistan is and how it got there. Now, the convention